Let's talk about another ES6 feature that's available in the latest version of Node, ES6 classes. It's basically a new way to build objects. But while it's a new way from a syntax standpoint, from the code that you write, it doesn't really change anything under the hood. And for that reason, it's called syntactic sugar. Big word alert. Syntactic sugar, a feature that only changes how you type something, but nothing really changes under the hood. And it's important to understand that, because when you understand what's happening under the hood, you don't make decisions based on flawed assumptions. And that's a bit of a danger with ES6 classes, and a reason why I like them, but I'm not completely sold by them. I think they're a little bit dangerous. But they can make writing and building objects a bit easier. Let's take a quick look. So here in my app.js file, I've loaded the code we wrote, you may recall, in the lecture on prototypal inheritance and function constructors. I have a simple function constructor person that adds a first name and last name property to the object being created, and then adds a greet method to the prototype down the prototype chain so that all objects get access to that method. Then we made a couple of objects, called that method, and double-checked that the prototype was what we thought it was. Now let's update this and change this to use new ES6 classes. To do that, I'm first going to actually add a line of code to the top of my file. Use strict. You may be familiar with this, but adding that line to the top of a JavaScript file or function means that the JavaScript engine will be pickier about things that it lets you or doesn't let you do. It helps you not make silly mistakes, and it's something you should do in real production code. We haven't been using it up till now because our examples are very simple, and we wanted to be focused on those. However, sometimes with new features, the engine will choose to only allow those new features to be used if we've opted in to using the stricter variety of JavaScript, that is, to be pickier about certain things we can do. So for example, I can't just use a variable without declaring it. If I didn't have use strict, this would run and make this a global variable. But if I have use strict, this will be an error unless I put the var keyword. So that's just an example. So in this case, to use classes, I need to have use strict right now in the version of Node that I'm using. But that's all I really need. So let's create our class. I'll say class person instead of function person. Now, that in itself means it's a constructor, essentially, a creator of objects. But it combines these couple of ideas that we use in function constructors and other ways to create objects and wraps them in simpler syntax. So first of all, when we create a new person, we pass a first name and last name to it into the function constructor. So how can I do that with a class? Well, I just use the word constructor and then give it the same properties, parameters, and then I have my curly braces, and I can actually use the exact same syntax. And I can get rid of my person function constructor. And the red lines are gone now. The red lines were just there because VS Code wasn't aware of the ES6 JSON file at that moment. But here we go. So I have a constructor, and whenever I call new, we still use the new keyword when we're using classes, then that will be called when I say new. Now what about adding methods to the prototype so that they're available in one spot and available down the chain to all objects created from this class? Well, it's actually quite simple. I just give myself some spaces here, no commas. This isn't like object literal syntax. And I just say greet. And then curly braces. And then I can take this exact same contents, get rid of that, And so what happens is anything you've added to the object inside constructor works like a function constructor in that it adds it to each object created. And any other methods you put inside the class are automatically put on the prototype, an empty object that's created and placed on it down the prototype chain. And then you can add methods to the prototype simply by them existing here within the class. So we can see this is a bit easier and cleaner looking for us to set up our objects. And actually, since I set it up the same way, we'll see that it works the exact same way. I can just run node app.js, and there, I was able to run both .greets and then check the 3 prototypes. Both prototypes are person and true, which helps us see what kind of object it is, that it's a kind of person, but it still set it up the exact same way that it set it up in other ways that we use, like function constructors and object.create. It's just setting up the prototype chain. Now again, this is new and clean. And so if you know what you're doing, if you understand how JavaScript objects and the prototype chain and prototypal inheritance work, this can be a really nice way, syntactically, to set up your objects. It's just syntactic sugar. However, I have my concerns about class as a new feature, because the idea of a class exists in many other programming languages, from which many new JavaScript developers may be coming. So if you're coming from C++ or programming in Java or C#, you may think you know what's going on when you see the word class. But in those other languages, classes are very, very different things. Inside JavaScript, class is just really syntactic sugar. It's essentially a function. And the constructor keyword and those properties and methods that you're putting on the prototype, that's all happening behind the scenes. And so you're separated a little bit from what's really going on. You don't even see the concept of prototype in the syntax. And so I have my concerns that newer developers to JavaScript will never quite learn properly what the prototype chain is if they only ever use class and never dig in. And worse, they might try to bring concepts and patterns from other programming languages into JavaScript, and it just doesn't work. The things that we do in C# or Java are very different from the kinds of things you should and can do in JavaScript, because prototypal inheritance is very different and in many ways simpler and easier to work with. It keeps us perhaps from creating large, monolithic, complex networks of objects, the kinds that sometimes we end up building in C# and Java if we're not careful. So that's why I like prototypal inheritance in JavaScript. And I like that originally we kind of saw a little bit more easily what was really going on. But that said, that doesn't mean you shouldn't use class. It's a great syntax. It makes your life easier when coding. However, you need to understand what's really going on. It's just syntactic sugar. All right, so let's move on and see how we might use this in Node.